A Guide to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Introduction. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, also known as the Bardo Thodol, is an ancient text that has its origin in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It is a guide to the intermediate state between death and rebirth. It is read or recited to someone who is dying or has recently died in order to help them navigate the hallucinations and visions that occur. The Tibetan Book of the Dead offers a unique perspective on the nature of consciousness and the human experience of death and rebirth, teaching that consciousness is not limited to the body and that death is not an end, but rather a transition to a new state of being. The Tibetan Book of the Dead origins can be traced back to the 8th century when the Tibetan king Trisong Detsen directed the Indian Buddhist master Padmasambhava to bring the teachings of Buddhism to Tibet. Padmasambhava, known also as Guru Rinpoche, brought the teachings on the bardos, or the states between death and rebirth, from his teachers in India. The teachings were later compiled into the text known today as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. However, the book is not considered to be Buddhist scripture in the traditional sense. Scriptures are texts that are the words of the Buddha or other enlightened beings, and they are considered to be the ultimate source of Buddhist teachings. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is considered to be terma, or a hidden treasure. Termas are believed to contain teachings that are specifically suited for the Tibetan cultural context. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, however, soon spread well past its Tibetan cultural context and across the globe, beginning with its translation into English. The text, which was written originally in Tibetan, was first translated into English by W.Y. Evans Wentz in 1927. It was later revised and retranslated by Francesca Fremantle and Kugyam Trungpa in 1975. The text has now been translated into many languages, making it widely accessible to readers all around the world. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhism, has said that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is, quote, a very useful guide for everyone on how to approach death and the period after death, end quote. He also emphasized the importance of the teachings as a source of inspiration and guidance in everyday life, not just during the process of dying or after death. In the 1960s, the Tibetan Book of the Dead became very popular with the Western counterculture movement, who were attracted to its teaching on consciousness and the nature of reality. During this time, it inspired many works of art, literature, and film, including Pink Floyd's album The Dark Side of the Moon and the Beatles' groundbreaking single Tomorrow Never Knows from the Revolver album. We will look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead's vast impact on Western culture later in this video. In recent times, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has gained a wider audience in the West through its incorporation into practices such as yoga and meditation. In life, you make the mind. What happens when we die? Physics tells us that energy cannot be destroyed. Thus, it is when we die. That pattern of energy that we call mind or consciousness, that we identify as ourselves, continues. The body drops, but that pattern of energy, that is consciousness, remains. Consciousness is no longer associated with the body. Consciousness also is no longer anchored by the body. Consciousness is in a sense floating free of the body. This might at first glance seem not a bad thing, especially if the body had been diseased or in terrible pain. Tibetan Buddhists, however, have a saying, quote, in life, you make the mind. In death, the mind makes you, end quote. What does this mean? That while you were alive, with the anchor of the body, when you thought something, you were limited on acting or releasing that thought by the limitation of the physical body. For example, if you thought, I would like to be in Paris, you would need to go through the whole process of getting on a plane, etc. Now, however, in death, when consciousness is loosed from the body. If you think I want to be in Paris, immediately you are in Paris, or at least the dream realm version. This might seem like a lot of fun until you begin to think of some of the not-so-great thoughts you have, thoughts that while alive are slowed in realization by the physical limit of the body, thoughts that in death will become your reality instantly, sometimes in rapid, unending, exhausting succession. Have you ever thought, I like to kill that person? Now, one might begin to get a sense of the importance that Tibetan Buddhists put on the purification of the mind while alive, while you are still anchored by the body. A purification based on gratitude, compassion, kindness, loving thoughts, and the deep recognition of the inherent empty ground of mind. In death, the mind is going to make you. The mind forms and dream realms that one tends to experience during the dying process and after death are formed by the type of thinking, the mind forms you entertained or clung to while alive. These mind forms and dream realms experienced during death and dying by the now bodiless consciousness formed during one's lifetime are called in the Tibetan Book of the Dead Bardos. Bardos are formed by the karmic energies or repeated thoughts that one accumulated during their lives. The purpose of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is to guide you through these bardos, but more than that, it is to help you recognize the unreality of them and thus become aware of the radiant, primal, and empty consciousness from which they arose and to which they will return. The bardos. The consciousness of the deceased passes through a series of bardos that exist between their death and rebirth. This lasts, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for a period of 49 days before being reborn into another body. While passing through these bardos, the consciousness of the deceased experiences a series of hallucinations and visions. These visions are caused by the karmic energies that have accumulated during the individual's previous lifetimes. These visions can be either of a positive or negative type, depending on the individual's past actions and the state they were in at the time of death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches that the ultimate goal is to recognize the true nature of these visions and to let them go in the primordial ground. If the deceased can recognize and release the visions appearing as they pass through the bardos, then they will attain a better birth and ultimately enlightenment. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is divided into 3 main sections: the Bardo of life, the Bardo of dying, and the Bardo of Dharma Nirvana. Each of these sections is further divided into sub-bardos that describe and map the various experiences and visions that may occur during the process of dying, after death, and in the process of rebirth. The Bardo of life. This is the Bardo of living. It includes the present moment and all of life's experiences. It does not, however, have any sub-bardos. The Bardo of dying. Sub-bardo of the inward experience of dying. Sub-bardo of the outward experience of dying. The Bardo of Dharma Nirvana. Sub-bardo of the experience of the clear light of reality. Sub-bardo of the experience of the ground luminosity. It is important to note that these sub-bardos are not necessarily distinct stages that occur in a linear progression. Instead, there are different aspects that may arise at any time during the process of dying, after death, or in the process of rebirth. The experience of the bardos. What does a person experience in a bardo according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead? Once the bardo of dying has begun, the person will experience different qualities of hallucinations or visions depending whether in the inward or outward sub-bardo. In the inward sub-bardo, which often occurs in the initial stages of dying, the person is likely to experience a sense of peacefulness or clarity, visions of deities, ancestors, or loved ones who have passed away, a sense of detachment from the body and the physical world, a feeling of lightness or weightlessness. The experiences of the inward sub-bardo, as suggested by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, share many similarities with those reports known as NDEs, or near-death experiences. We will look at some of those similarities in a moment. In the outward sub-bardo, which often occurs in the initial stages of dying, the person is likely to experience physical sensations such as heat, cold, pressure, or pain, sensations of movement or being pulled in different directions, sounds or voices that they may hear. Beyond the initial sub-bardos of the inward and outward is another root bardo, the bardo of Dharma Nirvana. The individual in this bardo may experience a further variety of hallucinations or visions depending on whether in the sub-bardo of clear light of reality or the ground luminosity. In the clear light of reality, they may experience a sense of pure, unmodified consciousness, a sense of unity with all of existence. In the ground luminosity, they may experience a sense of the primordial awareness that underlies all of existence, visions of various deities or celestial realms. These descriptions are very generalized. Each individual's experience of a bardo or sub-bardo may be very different. However, it is held by the Tibetan Buddhists and the Tibetan Book of the Dead that the most auspicious stage, and the stage for the greatest chance of an improved rebirth or even enlightenment, is while passing through the bardo of Dharma Nirvana. The Tibetan Book of the Dead and NDEs. Near-death experiences, NDEs, are first-hand reports from people who have experienced a near-death event, such as a cardiac arrest or a serious accident. The overwhelming reports from NDEs is that the person often experiences a profound sense of peace, a sense of not being limited to the body, loving encounters with deceased loved ones or spiritual beings. Some researchers have noted that there are striking similarities between the descriptions of NDEs and the bardos described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One of the main similarities between NDEs and the bardos is the sense of peace and well-being, as we have seen in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The bardo of dying and the bardo of Dharma Nirvana can be states of great peace and clarity, free from suffering, and where one is able to connect with their enlightened nature. Similarly, many people who have had NDEs report feeling a sense of profound peace and acceptance during their experience, even if they were previously experiencing great physical pain or fear. This sense of peace is often described as being much deeper and more profound than anything they had ever experienced in everyday life. This is often accompanied by a sense of being at one with the universe or with God, Source, or a higher power. NDE's reports also describe an experience of consciousness expanding beyond the limits of the body. Both the bardos of dying and Dharma Nirvana are described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead as states where the individual's consciousness becomes detached from the body and experiences an expansive and limitless sense of being. NDEs report having left their body and being able to observe the surroundings from many different perspectives. NDEs and the Tibetan Book of the Dead both report encounters with deceased loved ones and/or spiritual beings. These encounters are often described as being extremely comforting and reassuring. Other similarities are experiencing radiant light, a sense of being outside of time and space, a sense of having access to profound insights and understanding. The altered state of consciousness experienced during the death process is often described both by NDEs and the Tibetan Book of the Dead as being more real and vivid than everyday reality. And those who have uniquely made a U-turn back into the bardo of living, those who have experienced a near-death experience and not the experience of death itself, return to life and report that the insights and deep wisdom that they gained during their near-death experience has gone on to have profoundly beneficial impact on the remainder of their lives. This insight and deep wisdom and profound benefit is also what is offered by a reading of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Tibetan Book of the Dead and Western culture. The Tibetan Book of the Dead has had a significant impact on Western culture. Many Western artists, writers, thinkers, and musicians have embraced the book because of its insights into the nature of consciousness and the human experience. A primary concept in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that of ego death. This is the idea that the ego, or sense of separate self, is a temporary and illusory construct that must be seen as false or unreal in order to achieve enlightenment. It is this idea which influenced those Western thinkers and artists on the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a source of creative inspiration and guidance. One prominent example is Timothy Leary. This famous controversial psychologist and counterculture icon was best known as a leading advocate of LSD as a means of achieving spiritual enlightenment. Leary, along with Ralph Metzner and Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, used the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a guide for their research on LSD and other psychedelics. They used the outlining of the bardos in the Tibetan Book of the Dead to understand and interpret what they believed were LSD's stripping away of ego defenses and its inducing psychological ego death and rebirth. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was not, however, merely used for understanding the effects of LSD. Many Western artists, writers and musicians utilized the book to create works of art. Here are just a few examples. French composer Pierre-Henri used the text as the basis for his pioneering 1963 electroacoustic ballet work La Voyage, released in 1967. The late 1960s band, the Third Bardo, took their name from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Finnish composer Erik Bergman composed a work titled Bardo Thodol in 1974. Philip K. Dick's 1969 novel Jöbik is inspired with the Tibetan text and features a direct quote from it by one of the characters. The 1991 book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche, is an updated version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. As recently as 2017, the American writer George Saunders released the experimental novel Lincoln in the Bardo, which became a bestseller and tells the story of Abraham Lincoln grieving the death of his son while passing through many of the bardos described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Screenwriter and film producer Bruce Joel Rubin considers his 1990 film Jacob's Ladder to be a modern interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The 2009 French film Enter the Void was based on the Tibetan text. In television, the popular show Twin Peaks includes a reference to the Tibetan Book of the Dead in an episode where a character is dying. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead continues to have an impact on Western culture. Conclusion. Despite its ancient origins, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is still relevant and important to read today. It provides a unique perspective on the nature of consciousness and the human experience of death and rebirth. Its teachings emphasize the importance of recognizing the true nature of reality and offer wise guidance on how to navigate the intermediate state between death and rebirth. For those people interested in exploring spiritual and philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and the meaning of life, the Tibetan Book of the Dead can provide profound insight and deep wisdom. But perhaps the most important reason to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the practical guidance it provides for those who are facing death or are caring for someone who is dying. The text provides a detailed map of the experiences and visions that may occur during the process of dying and after death. It offers practical guidance and step-by-step instructions on how to navigate the arising experiences during the death process. This can be especially helpful for those who are dealing with the practical and emotional challenges of caring for someone who is dying, as it can provide a sense of direction and purpose in the face of such a difficult time. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is also an important cultural and literary work. This classic text of Tibetan Buddhism has played a significant role in the development of Tibetan culture and spiritual practice. The reading of the Tibetan Book of the Dead provides invaluable insight into the history and culture of Tibet, as well as its broader Buddhist tradition. The Tibetan Book of the Dead also emphasizes the importance of mindfulness and compassion. The text advises the deceased and the living to cultivate mindfulness and to cultivate a compassionate attitude towards all beings. Thus, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not merely guidance for the dead and dying, but for the living as well. By reading and taking in its wisdom, one will cultivate a deeper understanding of the nature of reality while developing a more compassionate and mindful approach to life.